I'm Vedika Sood in New Delhi, and this is CNN.
There's an hour left on today's trading day. Start of the new week. It is a Monday. The Dow is in the green. Started lower, but it's gathered steam throughout the course of the session. Not huge numbers, but 35,000 is on the horizon. The markets, and today the markets take a very much a back seat to the main events that we're going to tell you about. The atrocities in the Ukrainian town of Bucha sparks calls for action. Western leaders are preparing to ratchet up the sanctions on Russia. The Binance chief executive tells me it's a myth that countries use crypto to avoid sanctions. And Twitter stock surges. Elon Musk has bought nearly 10% of the shares. Good day to you, live from New York. Monday, April the 4th, new week together. I'm Richard Quest, and I'm in business. Good evening. The West is tonight vowing stiffer sanctions against Russia after seeing the horrific images of civilians who've been slaughtered in a city near Kyiv. Ukrainian officials are telling CNN they are recovering dead bodies numbered in the hundreds after Russian forces were forced and left the area. The Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, visited the suburb of Bucha. He says what happened there is genocide. And President Biden is calling the atrocities a war crime. CNN's Fred Pleitgen was one of the first journalists to enter the city after the Russian withdrawal. He filed this report. And please, a warning, it does have disturbing images.
As Russian forces retreat from the area north of Kyiv, there scenes of utter destruction. Whole blocks of houses flattened, Ukrainian authorities saying they believe dead bodies are still lying underneath. But here, the dead also lay in the open. Ukrainian National Police showed us this mass grave in Bucha, saying they believed up to 150 civilians might be buried here, but no one knows the exact number. People killed while the Russian army occupied this town. This is what it looks like when the hope is crushed. Vladimir has been searching for his younger brother, Dmitry. Now he's convinced Dmitry lies here, even though he can't be 100% sure. The neighbor accompanying him with strong words for the Russians. Why do you hate us so much, she asks. Since the 1930s, you've been in Ukraine. You just want to destroy us. You want us gone. But we will be. Everything will be okay. I believe it. Video from Bucha shows bodies in the streets after Russian forces left the area. Hands tied behind their backs. The Russian Defense Ministry denies killing civilians and claims images of dead civilians are, quote, fake. But we met a family just returning to their house in Borodyanka, which they say was occupied by Russian soldiers. They show us the body of a dead man in civilian clothes they had found in the backyard. His hands and feet tied with severe bruises and a shell casing still laying nearby. Russia's military appears to have suffered heavy losses before being driven out of the area around Kyiv. This column of armored vehicles in Bucha completely destroyed. The way the Ukrainians tell us is that Russians were trying to go towards Kyiv and they were then intercepted by Ukrainian drones, artillery, and also the Javelin anti-tank weapons. It's not clear how many Russians were killed here, but they say many were and others seen. A national police officer says the Russian troops were simply too arrogant. They thought they could drive on the streets and just go through, he says, that they would be greeted as though it's all right. Maybe they think it is normal to drive around looting, to destroy buildings and to mock people, but our people didn't allow it. And now it appears all the Russians have withdrawn from here. Ukraine says it is now in full control of the entire region around Kyiv. But it is only now that the full extent of the civilian suffering is truly coming to light.
Now, after those appalling scenes, we are waiting for the White House press briefing to begin. We're on a 2-minute warning which means that, well, we're about a minute into it, so it tends to happen fairly on time. We are expecting to hear from the White House further reaction to those atrocities. Obviously, President Biden has already said that they are war crimes. But I guess saying that and knowing what they're going to do about it is something completely different. President Zelensky continues to call upon the international community to offer greater support in help. And of course, whilst we focus on what is happening in Bucha and the withdrawal from Kyiv, it is important to reflect and remember that all that's happening is they are withdrawing, is a transference, if you will, of Russian firepower to the east of the country, to the Donbass and the Luhansk region, which of course ultimately might prove to be what the Russians, awful phrase, but take as the consolation prize, if you will, in any negotiations. Not if President Zelensky has anything to say about it. So there you have the White House. I'm not going to get involved in anything else just at the moment because Jen Psaki will be out fairly soon. As we continue in our hour, we will be looking at the sanctions regimes that have been put in place. We told you, of course, last week that as far as many Western leaders believe, there is an economic war underway against Russia. Here is the White House press secretary.
And then we will do a briefing from there. That'll turn over to Jim.
Hi, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. With apologies to Jen and to you, my remarks are not going to be so brief because I have a number of points I want to get through before opening it to questions. First, you heard the president today condemn in powerful terms the atrocities committed by Russian forces retreating from Bucha and other towns in Ukraine. The images that we see are tragic, they're shocking, but unfortunately, they're not surprising. We released information even before Russia's invasion, showing that Russia would engage in acts of brutality against civilians, including targeted killings of dissidents and others they deemed a threat to their occupation. And as the horrific images that have emerged from Bucha have shown, that's exactly what they have done. We had already concluded that Russia committed war crimes in Ukraine, and the information from Bucha appears to show further evidence of war crimes. And as the president said, we will work with the world to ensure there is full accountability for these crimes. We are also working intensively with our European allies on further sanctions to raise the pressure and raise the cost on Putin and on Russia. Today, I'd like to take a step back and talk about where we are and where we think we are going. Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine more than a month ago. When Russia started this war, its initial aims were to seize the capital of Kyiv, replace the Zelensky government, and take control of much, if not all, of Ukraine. Russia believed that it could accomplish these objectives swiftly and efficiently. But Russia did not account for the strength of the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people, or the amount or effectiveness of military assistance provided by the United States and its allies and partners. The Ukrainian people, backed resolutely by the United States and other nations, have held firm. Kyiv and other cities still stand. The Ukrainian military has performed exceptionally well, and many Ukrainian civilians have joined local militias in addition to using nonviolent means to resist. Vladimir Putin also believed that the West would not hold together in support of Ukraine. Russia was surprised that President Biden and the United States were so effective in rallying the world to prepare for and respond to the invasion. And after President Biden reinforced and reinvigorated Western unity at a series of summits in Brussels just 11 days ago, the Russians have now realized that the West will not break. At this juncture, we believe that Russia is revising its war aims. Russia is repositioning its forces to concentrate its offensive operations in eastern and parts of southern Ukraine, rather than target most of the territory. All indications are that Russia will seek to surround and overwhelm Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. We anticipate that Russian commanders are now executing their redeployment from northern Ukraine to the region around the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces are already well on their way of retreating from Kyiv to Belarus, as Russia likely prepares to deploy dozens of additional battalion tactical groups constituting tens of thousands of soldiers, to the front line in Ukraine's east. We assess Russia will focus on defeating Ukrainian forces in the broader Luhansk and Donetsk provinces, which encompasses significantly more territory than Russian proxies already controlled before the new invasion began in late February. Russia could then use any tactical successes it achieves to propagate a narrative of progress and mask or try to discount or downplay prior military failures. In order to protect any territory it seizes in the east, we expect that Russia could potentially extend its force projection and presence even deeper into Ukraine beyond Luhansk and Donetsk provinces. At least, that is their intention and their plan. In the south, we also expect that Russian military forces will do what they can to try to hold the city of Kherson, to enable their control of the water flow to Crimea, and try to block Mykolaiv so that Ukrainian forces cannot proceed to retake Kherson. In the north, Russia will likely keep pressure on Kharkiv. During this renewed ground offensive in eastern Ukraine, Moscow will likely continue to launch air and missile strikes across the rest of the country to cause military and economic damage, and frankly, to cause terror, including against cities like Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Lviv. Russia's goal in the end is to weaken Ukraine as much as possible. Russia still has forces available to outnumber Ukraine's, and Russia is now concentrating its military power on fewer lines of attack. But this does not mean that Russia will succeed in the east. So far, Russia's military has struggled to achieve its war aims, while Ukraine's military has done an extraordinary and courageous job demonstrating its will to fight and putting its considerable capabilities to use. The next stage of this conflict may very well be protracted. We should be under no illusions that Russia will adjust its tactics, which have included and will likely continue to include wanton and brazen attacks on civilian targets. And while Moscow may be interested now in using military pressure to find a political settlement, if this offensive in the east proves to gain some traction, Russia could regenerate forces for additional goals, including trying to gain control of yet more territory within Ukraine. Now, as the images from Bucha so powerfully reinforce, now is not the time for complacency. The Ukrainians are defending their homeland courageously, and the United States will continue to back them with military assistance, humanitarian aid, and economic support. We know that military assistance is having a critical impact on this conflict. Ukrainians are effectively defending themselves with US-produced air defense systems and anti-tank systems, such as Stingers and Javelins, as well as radar systems that give the Ukrainians early warning and target data, and multiple other forms of arms and munitions. The administration is working around the clock to fulfill Ukraine's main security assistance requests, delivering weapons from US stocks where they are available, and facilitating the delivery of weapons by allies where allied systems better suit Ukraine's needs. This is happening at what the Pentagon has described at an unprecedented pace. Last Friday, we announced an additional $300 million in security assistance, bringing the U.S. commitment to $1.65 billion in weapons and ammunition since Russia's invasion, and $2.3 billion since the beginning of the administration. The latest package includes laser-guided rocket systems, Puma unmanned aerial systems, armored high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, and more. Material is arriving every single day, including today, from the United States and our allies and partners. And we will have further announcements of additional military assistance in the coming days. We are working with the Ukrainians, as I said, to identify solutions to their priority requests. In some cases, that means sourcing systems from other countries because the U.S. either doesn't have the system or doesn't have a version that could effectively be integrated into the fight. Sorts of systems like this include longer-range anti-aircraft systems, artillery systems, and coastal defense systems. So let's take coastal defense systems as an example. President Biden went to Brussels to talk to key allies 11 days ago about how to get coastal defense systems to Ukraine, because there is not, at the moment, a good U.S. option. Last week, the UK announced at the close of its donor conference that coastal defense systems would be provided to the Ukrainians. It is a good example how, working with allies and partners, we are successfully responding to Ukraine's requests. We expect additional new capabilities to be delivered in the near future. We can't always advertise what is being delivered for our allies and partners or for operational sensitivities, but we are moving with speed and efficiency to deliver. Let me close with this. Even as Russia acknowledges the failure of its initial plans and shifts its goals, three elements of this war remain constant. First, Russia will continue to use its military to try to conquer and occupy sovereign Ukrainian territory. Second, the Ukrainian military and people will continue to effectively and bravely defend their homeland. And third, the United States will stand by them for as long as it takes. Russia has tried to subjugate the whole of Ukraine, and it has failed. Now it will attempt to bring parts of the country under its rule. It may succeed in taking some territory through sheer force and brutality, but no matter what happens over the week, it is clear that Russia will never be welcomed by the Ukrainian people. Instead, its gains will be temporary as the brave Ukrainian people resist Russian occupation and carry on their fight for an independent, sovereign nation that they so richly deserve. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask you about the president's call for a war crimes trial for Vladimir Putin? What are the mechanics of how the president sees that playing out? Would it be at the International Criminal Court or in some other tribunal?
So we have to consult with our allies and partners on what makes most sense as a mechanism moving forward. Obviously, the ICC is one venue where war crimes have been tried in the past, but there have been other examples in other conflicts of other mechanisms being set up. So there's work to be done to work out the specifics of that. And between now and then, every day, what we are focused on is continuing to apply pressure to the Russian economy and provide weapons to the Ukrainian people to be able to defend themselves.
Sorry, forgive me. Other forums for this might include something that the UN Security Council might adopt. Is that what you're suggesting, that you would go to the Security Council?
Well, obviously, with Russia as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it would be difficult to imagine that they would not attempt to exercise their veto to block something. But there have been creative solutions to the question of accountability in the past, and I'm not going to prejudge what solution would be applied here or what forum or venue would be applied here. What I will say is what the president said this morning. There has to be accountability for these war crimes. That accountability has to be felt at every level of the Russian system, and the United States will work with the international community to ensure that accountability is applied at the appropriate time. Yes.
The president was careful to say he does not see this as genocide. Many Ukrainians believe that it is because their nation, their people are being attacked. Where is the line in your view, and how have you counseled the president between genocide and war crimes?
So this is something we, of course, continue to monitor every day. Based on what we have seen so far, we have seen atrocities, we have seen war crimes, we have not yet seen a level of systematic deprivation of life of the Ukrainian people to rise to the level of genocide. But again, that's something we will continue to monitor. There is not a mechanical formula for this. There is a process that we have run just recently at the State Department to ultimately determine that the mass killing of Rohingya in Burma constituted genocide. That was a lengthy process based on an amassing of evidence over a considerable period of time and involving, frankly, mass death, the mass incarceration of a significant portion of the Rohingya population. And we will look to a series of indicators along those lines to ultimately make a determination in Ukraine. But as the president said today, we have not arrived at that conclusion yet. Yes.
Thanks. I just have three quick questions. When you say the next stage will be protracted, do you mean years? I mean, Russia has been in Crimea and Donbass since 2014. What's protracted?
So we can't predict, but I would just say that so far this conflict has lasted a little more than 5 weeks. And yet, in that time, we've seen an enormous amount of killing and death, and also an enormous amount of bravery and success on the part of the Ukrainian forces. What I'm saying when I say protracted is that it may not be just a matter of a few more weeks before all is said and done. That first, quote-unquote, phase of the conflict, of the Russians have put it, was measured in weeks. This next phase could be measured in months or longer.
In the beginning, the consensus seemed to be Russia was unstoppable. We just had to make the price as high as possible for them. Then new thinking is maybe Ukraine can actually win. Do you agree with that, and what would winning look like?
So we believe that our job is to support the Ukrainians. They will set the military objectives. They will set the objectives at the bargaining table. And I'm quite certain they are going to set those objectives at success. And we are going to give them every tool we can to help them achieve that success. But we are not going to define the outcome of this for the Ukrainians. That is up for them to define and us to support them in. That's what we're going to do. And we do have confidence in the bravery, skill, and capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces and the resilience of the Ukrainian people.
One quick thing on chemical weapons. The president and other allies have promised consequences without saying what they would be. Last time Russia used chemical weapons, there were sanctions, but not very stiff ones. Are you ready to define consequences?
So I'm going to say the same thing I've said from this podium that the president has said from a podium down the hall in this same building, which is that Russia will pay a severe price. We have communicated to them directly. We have coordinated with our allies and partners, and I'm not going to go further in terms of the specifics here today.
The administration initially did not call this war crimes, and eventually they did after what they saw on the ground. Do you think that's going to be the case with calling it a genocide?
Well, so first, it's not just that we sit around and debate terms and then ultimately decide to apply a term based against static circumstances. We watch as things unfold. We gather evidence. We continue to develop facts. And as we gathered evidence and as we got the facts together, we ultimately came to the conclusion that war crimes were committed. And in fact, I would say on this front, President Biden was a leader. He went out and said, Putin is a war criminal. And many of you raised your eyebrows at that. Many people out in the public raised their eyebrows at that. And now you see the scenes coming out of Bucha today. And so he's not going to hesitate to call a spade, to call it like he sees it, and neither is the U.S. government. So as the facts develop, could we see ourselves reaching a different conclusion on that question? Of course we could, but it's going to be based on evidence and facts as we gather it along the way.
And two more quick ones for you. On the sanctions that the president was talking about today, should we expect those this week, or what's the timing?
You can expect further sanctions announcements this week, and we are coordinating with our allies and partners on what the exact parameters of that will be. But yes, this week we will have additional economic pressure elements to announce.
Thank you. And my last question quickly, you keep using the word retreat instead of reposition. How much is that in part due to the spring conditions, the muddy conditions that are on the ground in Ukraine?
The reason I use the phrase retreat is just kind of quite simple common sense. It's not some fancy technical military term. It's a term that all of us understand, which is if you run pell-mell for an objective and you get stopped and then you start to get beaten back and then you withdraw, you pull out, that's what I would call a retreat. That's what happened to the Russians in Kyiv. They attacked Kyiv, they failed, they started to get beaten backwards by the Ukrainian military, and they ultimately retreated back across the border into Belarus. Now, with those forces, as I said in my opening comments, they are not intending to stand pat. They are going to reposition those forces to go after a different objective, a scaled-down objective, but nonetheless a dangerous and disturbing objective, which is to conquer and occupy territory in eastern Ukraine. And now it's our job to help the Ukrainian people have the tools they need to be able to stymie that objective. That is what we're intent on doing at this time.
I know you're not willing to call it a genocide, but does the U.S. government have information that you can that you can use to independently corroborate Ukraine's allegations about atrocities in Bucha?
So we have obviously got access to a lot of the information that you all have. We also have information that the Ukrainians have provided us directly, and we will also work with fact finders, independent fact finders as we go forward to get to a level of documentation that allows us to help build very strong dossiers of evidence for war crimes prosecutions, and that is what we intend to do. Now, on the question of the genocide determination, obviously we will continue on a daily basis to have consultations with the Ukrainians to reach determinations, and if at some point we reach the judgment that there in fact has been a level of atrocity, a level of killing, a level of intentional activity that rises to meet our definition of genocide, we'll call it for what it is. We have never hesitated to call out the Russians for what they have done in Ukraine, and we will not start now.
Sorry, one quick question.
So that is Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talking at the White House. John Harwood, our White House correspondent, joins me now. Very serious issues under discussion here, the definitional aspects of genocide, war crimes, and how the US is going to proceed. Particularly, of course, what he says there, of course, is avoiding maybe the UN Security Council where Russia would have a veto.
That's right, but the administration and the president have clearly decided, Richard, that they're not going to be able to deflect direct attribution of war crimes once the images that we've seen out of Bucha emerged. And so the president, when he got off Marine One today, said emphatically, as he had done previously, but he reiterated that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, so he's going to prepare additional sanctions. Jake Sullivan just told us we'll see some of those sanctions this week. It's going to be interesting to see where they go with the sanctions, because the one area that they had shied away from because of potential economic blowback on Europe, more so than the United States, but also the United States, was to stop the purchase of Russian oil and gas, which will have economic consequences that echo around the world. But that may be on the table now, because once you see the things that everyone around the world has seen, it's very difficult to look away and not to respond. And Sullivan said he also thought that the Russians were preparing for a very long, protracted campaign in which there will be more killing of this kind. So it's a pretty grim message from the National Security Advisor.
John Howard, who's at the White House or in Washington for us. John, thank you. Taking on what John has said, when we come back after in just a moment, we're going to develop that further, the ramping up of sanctions on Ukraine, where they will likely to go. And India continues to buy Russian crude at a rapid rate as the price is low, and they're getting a good bargain. But where India stands on all of this could become crucial. In a moment.
When you freeze fruits and vegetables, you actually help lock in nutrients, especially vitamin C. So if you've got extra fruit you might not eat right away, freezing is a great choice. In fact, you'll often get more nutrients out of the food if you freeze it when it's fresh than if you let the produce sit in your refrigerator. A University of Georgia study found that after 5 days, most fresh produce loses vitamin content, especially vitamin A, vitamin C, and folate. Freezing is a way to push the pause button So keep your freezer full of fruits and veggies to enjoy in smoothies or as side dishes. And you don't have to do it yourself. Buying frozen fruits and vegetables is a healthy choice too. Frozen peas or spinach may contain more vitamin C than their counterparts that have been sitting in the produce section for days.
In Irpin, Ukraine, and this is CNN.
EU officials are now discussing sanctions, once thought difficult and impossible, as you heard there from the White House, a ban on Russian energy. It would certainly damage key economies like Germany. However, President Macron of France said Europe must respond.
What happened in Bucha demands a new round of sanctions against Russia in very clear measures. And so we will coordinate with our European partners, especially in Germany, and we will take our own additional measures. And I favor for us to have a round of sanctions and for us to be able to act regarding coal and oil in particular, which we know are particularly painful for them.
So far, the West's blocked exports to Russia and frozen its overseas bank assets and targeted the oligarchs. You can see the sort of sanctions pyramid, if you like. Banning oil, that's the next rung up, it would be a major escalation in the economic war. But it would still fall short of the most extreme measure, a full financial embargo prohibiting all trade and transactions with Russia, say, for example, in the same situation as Iran. Adam Smith is a former senior sanctions advisor to the US Treasury and has helped us understand these things, a former war crimes researcher. He joins me now. As we go up this pyramid, what is the next measure in your view? Bearing in mind the atrocities we've seen, and everybody's saying we need to ramp up sanctions. What is the next level?
Well, thanks for having me. I think I see two different options. On the one side are the targets of specific sectors. So that's where the energy sector comes in, sanctioning or prohibiting the flow of oil and gas to Europe. On the other side is sort of an implementation enforcement strategy. And here, coming from the Iran program, we know something called secondary sanctions are a possibility. And that would be sanctions on jurisdictions that continue to trade with Russia, much as we saw in the Iran context. So either or, going after the energy sector or going after secondary sanctions seem to be a potential next step.
Secondary sanctions, in other words, for example, going after India because it's continuing to trade, going after those countries that Turkey arguably, but that's really tricky because that could fray and destroy your bilateral relationships, and you do still need those countries.
Indeed, that's always been the challenge. Secondary sanctions from a U.S. perspective have almost always been forced on the president by Congress, rather than the president doing it him or herself. And the reason for that is exactly as you said, that it frays the diplomatic sort of endeavor. Right. But I do think that's possible, especially after what we've seen today.
Oil. So assuming that the Europeans decide that it is time to eat the economic pain from that, from your experience of sanctions regimes, is that where we're heading?
I think so. Again, the Iran program is the most sort of like this one in a way in the ramp up. And at the end of the day, what you saw with Iran leading up to the nuclear deal back in 2015, 2016 was the Europeans finally turning the taps off and having an oil embargo, which impacted the Europe for sure, not as nearly as much as it would for Russia, because of course the need of Russian oil and gas is significantly greater than the need for Iranian oil and gas. But that's certainly something that they turned to right at the end, as they saw the pressure needed to be ramped up quickly.
I remember at the beginning of the process, we were told you don't put everything on the table at once. You go up slowly but surely. But the ultimate is, of course, a total ban on any form of transactions with Russia, which is what you head towards. Do you think we'll get to that stage?
I don't think so. I mean, it's certainly possible. And I think what we saw today, the war crimes, whatever comes out from the genocide discussions that we heard the National Security Advisor talk about could lead to that. But I just think that what we're dealing with Russia is a different circumstance when you're dealing with such a large economy. To say they're going to shut the entire economy of Russia off for the world, that's a very different circumstance than Iran or Cuba in the U.S. context or North Korea. It's a very different sort of consequences collaterally for both the Russian people, which I think is critical to remember, let alone the world economy.
Sir Adam Smith, thank you. We will talk more in the future because this is not going away, if you will, and so we'll be back to talk more with you. Thank you. Cryptocurrency rules are facing renewed scrutiny as the West moves to cut off Russia. The US Treasury has warned crypto can be used to dodge Western sanctions. In the EU, lawmakers want tighter tracing rules. Major exchanges are pushing back. Binance and Coinbase say they comply with all government sanctions. And unlike Main Street Finance, they're not leaving Russia. Both reject an outright ban on Russian users. I asked the CEO of Binance to explain the decisions.
First of all, Binance follows all the sanction rules very strictly. So we will block anyone that's on the sanction list, or even anyone that's remotely related to them. I mean, they're like their wives, their lawyers, and what people would call with their mules, typically their friends. That's our position. But we also view that we do not have the ability to freeze other normal Russian users' assets because we view that's illegal for us to do. It's not for us to decide whose assets we can freeze and not freeze. That's for governments to decide. On the second point of using crypto to avoid sanctions, I think that's a myth. If you look at the data, nobody smart does that. Crypto is too traceable. The governments around the world are increasingly very good at tracing crypto transactions. So crypto is not good for that.
To be clear, have you and will you now take a stand on the war? Because a lot of people feel that crypto, the new distributed finance mechanisms, a lot of people seem unwilling to say right or wrong, yes or no, for or against.
Yeah, we're totally against the war. We're totally against politicians, dictators that starts the wars. So that part we're totally against. We're not against the people. So there are many people on both sides of Ukraine and Russia that are suffering, and we want to help those people. In fact, I think we are the first companies to pledge $10 million to help the Ukraine refugees. And we have already given most of that out already through UN, international charity refugee organizations. So yeah, we have a very strong stand on that.
Last question on this area. Do you think a lot of people in the fintech industry, and I'm asking you this because you've taken a strong stand yourself, do you think too many people are going around saying, see no evil, hear no evil, it reminds me of the old shared platforms argument at the beginning on copyright issues. We're just a shared platform. Do you think that fintech does need to come off the, as an industry, come off the fence more often?
I think fintech, if you include traditional finance, that is true. I think there's too many people focusing on crypto. Crypto is actually not good for avoid sanctions. And if you look at the Bitfinex hackers, they hacked Bitfinex for billions of dollars in 2016. They held on to the money until recently. The minute they started using it, they got caught. So, and if you look at chain analysis data, last year, only 0.15% of the crypto transactions may be potentially related to illicit activities, where the United Nations published a data 2 to 5% of fiat transactions, or what we call the banking industry, are associated with illicit activities. So the data shows that crypto is much, much safer, yet everybody's focused on crypto sanctions. Nobody talking about banks, cash, oil, etc.
Because originally crypto made a great virtue of anonymity, and our old friend Bitcoin came along and said you won't be able to trace or follow or know who's behind the transaction, and that gave the reputation, and once sullied, it's difficult to get rid of.
Yeah, so that's a bit unfortunate because that's very misleading right now. Because most transactions do need to go through a centralized exchange, any large transactions of value, because the decentralized exchanges don't have enough liquidity yet. And when they go through centralized exchanges like us, we KYC everybody. There are small exchanges who still doesn't do that, but the larger exchanges, the more compliant exchanges, KYC everybody. And once you know that one transaction is associated with somebody, on the blockchain, it's very easy to follow that along afterwards. So that's a misconception that Bitcoin is anonymous. Bitcoin's anonymous feature is very, very weak.
And talking about sanctions there, but tomorrow you'll hear much more of the interview with Changpeng Zhao as we discuss the wider issues of crypto and regulation. It's on tomorrow night's Quest Means Business. In a moment, Elon Musk is no longer one of Twitter's biggest users. He's now one of its owners as well. We'll discuss that in just what it means.
Wherever you go in the world, one airline goes further to make it feel exceptional. Qatar Airways, going places together.
There were 3 strikes that hit this facility. This is as close as you're going to get.
Just look at the utter destruction caused by this massive explosion.
Imagine the good fortune of the truck driver. He managed to survive.
More than a month into the war here in Ukraine, and the refugee crisis continues.
It is not even remotely close to being a ceasefire.
In Kiev, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Lviv, this is CNN.
We released last year the very first motorcycle with radar. And what that's allowed us to do is to be able to put some technology in the motorcycle that gives features of safety for the rider, including blind spot indicators that's been used on cars for years. So we're not only dedicated to that performance, but also to try and improve our environmental impact and also the safety for the riders themselves.
So many questions about what is the federal government doing. Do you get the anger that is out here?
How concerned are you about the front line?
You don't believe that there's a racial divide here?
Looking back, as president, did you tell the story of race in America enough, do you think?
All the places I've been and all the things I've seen, all the people I've talked to, I carry with me. They're a part of what I do right here, holding the powerful accountable, keeping them honest.
AC 360, Tuesday through Saturday only on CNN.
Some news to bring you. Russia's ambassador to the United Nations is holding a briefing at the moment just outside the UN. He says much of the reporting concerning Bucha has been misinformation. And he says Russia's been blocked from telling its side of the story at the UN Security Council. We're listening in, and when there's more to bring you on what he says, of course, we will bring it immediately to you. But it's at the moment, he's classifying or clarifying it as misinformation. India is ignoring Western sanctions and buying Russian oil at a discount. Reuters says the country has bought at least 13 million barrels of Russian crude oil since late February. They only bought 16 million in the whole of last year. Now, India reports 85% of its crude oil. Ravi Agrawal is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and he was CNN's bureau chief in Delhi, but he joins me now. I guess, look, they can't, I suppose, be blamed in a sense if they're going to get their oil on the cheap, but they are not making any friends, if you like, in their studied neutrality is likely to only inflame matters worse.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, Richard. It is studied neutrality. India is yet to condemn Russia by name. It's abstained at the United Nations every single time it could do so. But, you know, the thing to keep in mind about the oil purchases is that India actually gets very little of its crude from Russia, just about 1% to 2% of its total amount. India, of course, is a net importer, so it needs to import about 75% of its needs. So it needs cheap oil. Obviously, with inflation, higher crude prices, that impacts India badly. So where they can find a deal, they will find a deal. At least that's what they will say. But I think where India has sort of upset the West more, where it has weathered more criticism, is the fact that it is the world's largest democracy. And I think countries like the United States have been expecting it or hoping that India would be a little bit tougher on Russia, at least rhetorically. I think that's where it probably hurts more, rather than the very small numbers we're talking about when it comes to crude purchases.
Right now, let's look at what the Prime Minister said recently when the Foreign Minister of Russia was there. The Prime Minister says India is on the side of peace. Well, I mean, I don't think anybody will disagree with that. But the lily-livered language that India has used, will there be at least embarrassed faces as the Bucha genocide becomes ever clearer?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the recent atrocities that are emerging just add ever more pressure on New Delhi, and I think it's going to get harder and harder for it to continue the study neutrality, as you call it, because the images are images that Indians are seeing as well. I think there will be some domestic pressure at home. But all of that said, what Indian diplomats have been saying recently, as they have to a whole troop of foreign ministers who've been in New Delhi over the last few weeks, is that, you know, Indians in general are more likely to care about what's going on in Afghanistan next door, which, let's not forget, also has a humanitarian disaster on its hands. And Ukraine is Europe's problem. This is what the Indian foreign minister has been saying, citing Indian people. So that might be their way of sort of distancing themselves a little bit. But this is a stance that is going to be harder and harder to continue, as you say.
Ravi, you're the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, so I make no apologies for just sort of moving around the world as we do. Viktor Orban got re-elected last night, fourth term, and then made some extraordinary comments, even by Orban's standing, claiming Zelensky is part of the opposition. Now, that's not going to go down very well in Brussels, which, of course, is also part of the opposition in his view. What's he on about here? What's the end game for Orban now he's been re-elected?
Well, I mean, for starters, he's just been re-elected despite a track record of saying all of these things. So in a sense, this says a lot about Hungary as well. But then, you know, the election itself was not free and fair. And Orban has long been, you know, an autocratic leader who has looked to, instead of to the West, he's looked to the East for inspiration. And so in a sense, none of this is surprising. But in as much as the last few years has become, you know, this sort of accelerated aligning of democracies against autocracies, and we're seeing those lines get ever more deepened, Orban is sort of putting his line in the sand and making clear where he stands, which for Hungary is very troubling.
If there's a part of the world that Ravi can't give us insight on, we've yet to find it. Good to see you, sir. Thank you. Ravi joining us. Now, Elon Musk is shaking up the world of social media. The Tesla chief executive has bought a stake in Twitter. In a moment.
I'm Andrea Vena. I'm the Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer at the European Space Agency. The great responsibility that ESA has to be responsible is linked very much to the fact that since decades our programs are contributing to the understanding of climate change. Our satellites are contributing to the climate variables that are used by scholars and scientists all over the world to identify what are the hotspots for climate change. Therefore, we feel accountable. We know what is the situation, and therefore it is very much important for ESA to be on the leading edge for fighting against climate change.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 70,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore cnn.com/impact. Click to take action.
Elon Musk has bought nearly 10% of Twitter for an investment of around $3 billion. The Twitter share price reacted dramatically, as you can see, up 27% on the news. Twitter, like many social medias, has lagged not only with the general market, but also, of course, by what's happened with Apple's new social media policy on disclosure, which, of course, has been very much a negative for Twitter and Snap. You'll see the way the shares have all sort of, and Facebook, of course, particularly, you can see it all there. Paul LaMonica is with me. Why has he bought this? What's behind it? What do we know?
Yeah, we really don't know a heck of a lot just yet, Richard. We do know that Elon Musk has taken shots at Twitter. He is a very vocal and active Twitter user, and he has been concerned about, a crackdown on free speech as he sees it, and there have been a lot of comments, from people wondering whether or not Musk would look to start his own social media service or go elsewhere. But I think clearly with this stake, he is presumably going to try and mold Twitter maybe more in his own image. With a nearly 10% stake, he is by far the largest investor in Twitter, and he can now, I think, throw some weight around even more so than just having, pretty sharply honed tweets. He has the money to back it up now, too.
But it is strange to make this level of investment and not say what you want to do, what your goal is. I mean, in the fullness of time, yes, but you'd have thought you'd have done that before now.
Yeah, it is a bit surprising, since I think there is one thing that we can say about Elon Musk pretty definitively, and that is that he is not one to be shy about his opinions or mince words or anything of that nature. So he might be biding his time a little bit. This is billed as a passive stake for now. Whether or not he looks to go more activist and try and really push for significant changes remains to be seen. But I think based on the surface, this is a friendly investment. And, whether or not Musk looks to exert more control, get board seats, that will be something that in the coming days and weeks we'll be watching very closely.
Now, the rising tide has lifted all boats. We were just looking there, even Facebook, which is up some 4% on the day, having been heavily down. This Apple business, this Apple tightening of user privacy, which really clobbered Facebook and indeed Snap. But I can see there's no direct correlation between the underlying issues of those social media companies and Musk's purchase. But Musk's purchase has put them all on a bit of a oomph.
Yeah, it could be perceived as a floor for social media stocks. You mentioned Facebook, Meta, your beloved Snapchat that we have talked about, obviously, in the past on the show. Pinterest as well is another social media stock that is surging even more today as well. And there's an ETF, SOCL, that owns all these stocks. It is roaring today, too. So investors, at least for now, possibly viewing Musk as having the Midas touch for not just Twitter, but all of social media.
I could feel your snigger on my Snap. Regular viewers will know, of course, I bought at 28 at the height of the IPO, suffered for many years. They're now at 39. I mean, let's leave that for online. All right, thank you, sir. The markets, I want to show you where we stand at the end of trading on Wall Street. 6 minutes to go before the end. We're up 90 points, so we're at, I think, just off the top.